Well, my name is David Brophy, and I was a navigator on a B-17. I flew with the 8th Air Force based in England. I flew from 1943 to 44, completing 25 missions, and then returned to the States as a recruiting officer and a navigation instructor until I was mustered out in early 44. I started out as a pilot, and I went through pre-flight at Santa Ana, California, and then went up to Santa Maria, California, where I flew Stearmans. And after about 13 or 14 hours, they determined that I would probably make a better navigator than a pilot, and they washed out about 60% of the class. I think it all depended on the need of certain classifications, if they needed fighter pilots or bomber pilots, and they made the decision to cut the classes once they got the figures. And so I returned to pre-flight training at Santa Ana, and then when I finished that, I went up to Sacramento, California, to navigation school at Mather Field. I graduated sometime in June of 1943 and went home on a pre-combat leave, I presume it would be called. I then reported to duty in South Dakota, and it was called phase training, and you were then assigned to a crew, and you went through 3 phases. When I arrived in Rapid City, the only thing I did was collect my first pay as an officer, and the group had gone on to Spokane, Washington for the 2nd phase, so I never did have first phase training. I joined the crew in Spokane, went through 2nd phase training in and around Spokane, and then went to Pendleton, Oregon for 3rd phase, which consisted of general flying around doing navigational problems, some gunnery out over the Pacific, and was then sent home on leave for about 2 weeks. I then reported to Grand Island, Nebraska. At that time, I was with the Bowman Provisional Group, and we were assigned new airplanes, and we took off from Grand Island, Nebraska, after having spent, say, a week there, if that, and flew from Grand Island to Bangor, Maine on the first leg, and spent a night or 2 in Bangor, and then flew to Gander in Newfoundland. And we spent 2 or 3 days there, and then we were given navigational instructions as how to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And we flew from Gander to Prestwick, Scotland. And I spent most of my time navigating. The rest of the crew was asleep. I think they were primarily on autopilot. But we made it safely to Prestwick. From Prestwick, we were assigned to a replacement depot to a place called Bovington. And we were under the tutelage of some RAF veterans on tactics used by the Germans and so on. One of the amusing incidents there was a crew came in that had come through Goose Bay, Labrador. And at that time, the civilian populace of the country were always giving cigarettes to the soldiers. And these guys showed up at Bovington with a whole case of cigarettes, not a carton, a case. And that was like having gold. I don't know to what advantage they put the cigarettes to use, but they always seemed to have one guy who stood over that case of cigarettes to guard it, because cigarettes were more important in England at that time than silk stockings or nylon stockings. We were then, after I presume 2 or 3 weeks of training at Bovington, we were assigned, I was assigned to the, or my crew, and I were assigned to the 381st Bomb Group, and our station was Ridgewell, and it was part of the 1st Division.
This is in the British Midlands, where was Ridgewell?
It's been hard put for me to even find an Englishman that knew where Ridgewell was, but it was part of the that section of England. Essex was the county, I believe. There was a certain. We were 25 miles south of Cambridge, and we were, as I said, we were probably the southernmost bomb group in the 1st Division. It's been hard put for me to even find an Englishman that knew where Ridgewell was, but it was part of the that section of England. Essex was the county, I believe. There was a certain. We were 25 miles south of Cambridge, and we were, as I said, we were probably the southernmost bomb group in the 1st Division.
No, was the 381st or the 8th Air Force was spread all over England, pretty much. There were
That's right.
Different places
Yes.
where squadrons were.
Right.
So you would all, if you went on a mission, you would all take off from different fields and rendezvous.
That's correct. We would be awakened at say 1 or 2 in the morning, and go through a briefing of the entire. All the officers were in one briefing. That was pilots, co-pilots, navigators, and bombardiers, and then we would break into a sectional briefing, a navigational briefing, bombardiers, etc. We were always given fresh eggs too on mission days.
Fresh as opposed to powdered.
Correct.
When did you first meet the whole crew that you would go on to fly with? Was it back
It's
in
in Spokane, because as I said earlier, I missed the first phase.
Now you grew up in New York.
Yes.
And what was it like when you met the crew? What was your reaction to your crew?
Well, we had, I was, of course, coming from New York City area. I was the sophisticated member. We had co-pilot from Red Cloud, Nebraska. The bombardier was from Chickasha, Oklahoma. My pilot was from Toledo, which was a fairly good-sized city. And our radio man was from New Jersey. The tail gunner was from upstate New York. There was quite an American mixture. There we had one gunner who was a tough Chicago kid. The radio man was a very erudite, scholarly type of a fellow, and a very fine radio man. But we all got along very well together. And we would, all the officers would go on leave together. We were given, about once a month, we would be given a 24-hour or 48, I think it was 48-hour pass. And we'd always go down to London, pick up the train at Ridgewell, and transfer to the main line. I've forgotten the name of the place at the moment, and end up in London. And the very first time that we went to London, they sort of leaned on me as to where we would stay. So being a New Yorker, I thought the best hotel in London was the Savoy. So we marched into the lobby of the Savoy, and the clerk said, "Are you booked?" And I never had heard the expression before. So I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, do you have a reservation?" I said, "No, we don't." Because most of the Kiwis or ground guys would, they had a latch on everything because they knew when they were going into town. So they would pretty much take up all of the hot spots in London. And we ended up in a West End bed and breakfast, or I guess boarding house at that time. And after we had breakfast, we went to the office's PX on Oxford Street, which was across from Selfridge, the department store. And while in line, we met a fellow from the Kansas City Star, and he invited us back to his hotel for drinks and lunch. And while there, he went down the hall and he brought John Steinbeck into the group. And the bombardier, coming from Oklahoma, started to give Steinbeck hell about the grapes of wrath. And when he got home, got back to the base, he wrote to the state paper, and he finally showed us the headline several weeks later. It said, "Local boy tells off Steinbeck." His son called me about a year or two ago. He has since died, and wanted to know if the story was true, and I told him it was. And many years later, I was cruising off in Long Island Sound, and we went ashore for dinner. And a group came in. There was a man and two women. And my wife looked up at him, and she said, "Congratulations." And I said, "Well, who's that?" And she said, "That's John Steinbeck, and he's just won the Pulitzer Prize." Oh, I said, "He's a dear, dear friend of mine." So I joined them at the table, and they knew the fellow from the Kansas City Star well. And so we got together, and we all went back to the boat together, and had a delightful visit with he and his wife and his sister. And that was the last I ever saw of him, but it was a very pleasant reunion.
So you can meet celebrities even in time of war.
Yes, he was writing at that time for the New York Herald Tribune.
So then you went to your first mission, right? What was that like when you? What was your first mission like? What was it like when you were first briefed, and what did that feel like when you went to that first briefing and then that first mission?
Well, of course, we had no idea what to expect, despite all the harrowing tales just told to us by the RAF guys at Bovington. But we really faced, a certain amount of apprehension. I think one of the early raids that we were scheduled for was Berlin, and that would be the end of the road for most of us at that time. But it was sort of part of your job, and I started off by not particularly wanting to take off in the nose, and I would go back in the radio room until I had all my gear and maps and everything all ready, and I would stay in the radio room. But then it became so annoying to go through the bomb bay with all those, with 10 500 pounds of bombs. And I said, the hell with it, and I decided I'd stay in the nose during the takeoff, which is the way I followed it all the way through.
Now, what was the basic layout of the plane on a B-17? And what there was, the bombardier sat in that nose.
The bombardier and I were up in the nose, and above us and slightly to the rear would be the pilot and co-pilot. Behind them would be, at the top turret, would be the engineer. And further back just after the bomb bay would be the radio man. And then we had the waist gunners and the ball turret gunner, who entered the turret through the bottom of the waist. And then, of course, you had the tail gunner.
So did you, you had almost like a little desk up there, right? Didn't you?
Yes, I had a regular desk, and I had two guns. I had one on the right and one on the left, 50 caliber machine guns. The bombardier had, in the later versions of the 17, had a twin 50 turret, which he operated.
Where do you remember where you went on that first mission or the first few missions? Do you remember any of the targets?
Well, I have a complete list of my missions. If you'd like me to pause a minute, I'll get it.
Well, just for now, we can get it later, but do you remember, was it a tough mission, the first one?
Well,
or
no, the first mission, was, as I recall it, was an airfield just outside of Paris. And it was not a milk run, but it was as close to a milk run as I was on. But from then on, we had a series of very tough missions. We had fellows who would quit after 3 missions. They just couldn't handle it. And then we had, as my 5th or 6th mission, Schweinfurt. And the 8th Air Force was really out of business for 2 or 3 days. We were all sent off on 48-hour passes. They could not mount a raid. They had so many planes We actually lost 60 on the raid, plus the total of, I guess, of bombers that were out of action was about 100.
So the so roughly your first fifth of the time you were there, you went on the Schweinfurt raid.
Yes.
You were fairly novice at that point.
That's correct. And I remember we went up to Cambridge, and I remember seeing my radio man sitting outside of King's College, Cambridge, and he said, "Lieutenant Brophy, it's simply a matter of time." Because at that time you were lucky if you got, to do 25 missions. You were an unofficial member or an official member of the Lucky Bastard Club. Because you made about 16, and if you did that well, you were doing fine. But we went all the way through. We lost a co-pilot on it. He was checked out as the first pilot, and he was lost on his last mission. We had all gone down to greet him, and he didn't come back, but he ended up as a POW. But
he was on a different plane, obviously.
yes, he was checked out as first pilot. He had his own crew.
You said that after 3 or 4 missions, some guys would just say, I can't do this. What were the consequences of
well, generally they would send you down to a psychiatric camp. It was rather vague. We weren't quite sure. One of the squadron commanders refused to go. My squadron commander refused to go on this mission, and they just had they sent him on down there, and I think after I finished up, he returned to combat duty. But they'd put you through all sort of psychiatric treatment and so on. But it was, it was really nerve shattering what you had to go through, and seeing. We didn't have any blood in our plane at all, but you'd see guys blow up and crash into one another and all that sort of stuff, and it was a pretty tough row. But we got through about 10 or 11 missions, and we were sent to what was called a flak house on I think it was a 1-week period. And the morning that we were all supposed to go, my pilot and co-pilot, bombardier, and I all went up, even though we were not flying because we were going down to the flak house, and had a fresh egg breakfast along with the combat crews that were going. And so we came back to our shack, and we all went to bed. And about a half hour after I got in bed with these half a dozen fresh eggs in my stomach, the door opens and the operations officer said, "Brophy, you're going as adjunct navigator on this mission in the lead plane to Bremen." I said, "I'm sick, I can't go," and I'm going to the flak house and all that. They said, "Oh, we'll fly you down later." Well, it ended up I went on the mission, and we lost several planes, but I was very fortunate. Nothing happened to us, and returned. And of course, when I got back, I said, "Well, you're going to fly me down?" They said, "No, we don't have any airplanes." So I had to take the train, and my Colonel Nazaro, the famous football player, was there, and he questioned me as to how things went that day, and I had to tell him we lost a couple of ships. And but this flak house was a great spot for 1 week. We were able to play golf and just lounge around and get fresh eggs. That was a big thing in our lives, fresh eggs, and was very worthwhile. I think it helped you go through the rest of the tour.
Now, what the flak house was? What I'm not sure what you mean by flak house.
Well, it was a house that was owned by a man named Hutchinson, who was a prominent English publisher, and he turned the house over to the Red Cross, and we had several Red Cross ladies there. One was Pam Humphreys, the daughter of the subsequent, I think, Secretary of the Treasury from Cleveland. She had just lost her husband. She was a Red Cross, I've forgotten what you call them, a hostess at that place. And we had an English butler who'd come in every morning, and he'd pull the blinds and say, "Gentlemen, it's a lovely morning," and you couldn't see your hand in front of your face with the fog. But we had a great time there. And then we returned to duty. The only real problem, I guess, that we ever had was after my co-pilot had been checked out as first pilot. And he flew, of course, in our squadron. And we were hit by a piece of flak, which prevented, it caused the prop to windmill, and we could not control it. And it burst into flames, and the flames would extinguish and then come back again. All the time this thing was windmilling around. And I asked the pilot for permission to send the bombardier back to the waist so that I could go back and forth, navigate, in case that prop came off and severed off the nose, which it could very well have happened. But our co-pilot saw we were in trouble, and he and his wingman, against all regulations, broke formation and escorted us back. And I dare say we would have been duck soup for the Jerrys, because any time they saw a plane with that was damaged or disabled in any way, they would jump on it. You know, it was weak sister. But he stayed with us all the way back, and I don't think he ever received any official criticism, and we were very grateful for that, because I think he saved, I won't say he saved our lives, but he could very well save the airplane, and we probably would have been prisoners of war if we weren't killed on the crash, either in Europe or on the Channel, in the Channel.
Tell me about the Schweinfurt raid, because it was obviously one of the most important raids in the whole war. What was that like? What was when were you first told about it, and when did you start planning, and what was it like?
Well, there had been a previous raid before I joined the group, and the 8th Air Force had suffered great losses on that one. So it was quite a bit of dread that we looked at this raid, and that's one of the reasons why the squadron commander, he said, you know, I've done this before, I'm not going back. And we were very fortunate through an error in our assembling. We couldn't find our wing, and we tacked in onto whatever group was going, whatever wing was going in as a high group. We had originally been scheduled to be low group, which
what's the difference? Could you
well, you had a lead group, and then you had a low group, and then a high group. And the low group was the most vulnerable, because the Jerrys would start out, come through the formation, roll over on their bellies, and always take out one or two of the low group as they came in. So as I said, due to an error on someone's part or just pure luck, we ended up as a high group. And I don't remember how many planes we lost. I don't think it was a horrific battle, though. The Jerrys were, we had no escort on that raid. We only had P-47s at that time, and they could only take us to the Rhine until they got wing tanks, and then they could take us a little further. But once they left, the Jerrys had a field day. And, they used to talk about the Flying Fortress, and we had a lot of armament, but we were no match against a fighter plane. It was like a mosquito attaching a giant bug.
So you're sitting up there, well, first of all, in the Schweinfurt raid, which was a ball bearing plant.
Right.
That Albert Speer writes about how important that was to keep it going, and I guess you guys knocked it out. How many planes roughly probably went on that raid when you started, and how many do you think came back? You probably can't remember, but I just wondered what kind of rough numbers.
We lost, I think I told you earlier, we lost actual losses of 60 planes, 60 crews. And the total number of planes that were damaged beyond use was about 100 all told. They could not mount a raid for several days, and we were all sent off on a 48-hour pass. We were out of business. And as a result of that raid, they thought there was some discussion whether they would discontinue daylight bombing. It was that terrible a blow at that time. But it was quite a scene because you had, as I said, the fighters, the Jerry fighters, were all around. None of our boys were there, of course, because they didn't have the range. So it was a turkey shoot for them. And you had a lot of bombers, crews. It would be, sometimes the planes would burst into flames and no one would get out. And others you'd see smoke coming out of them, and you'd see the crew, and you'd try to count the number of bodies that you went out. And if they got free of the plane, they were generally safe and parachuted. If they were shot down over France, they had a good chance of making their way out through the underground. And that's this sudden feeling against the French, is hard to take for me, because I know how they risked their lives in saving some of my friends. And that's a tale in itself, those fellows. One of my friends was a navigator. He was also a 7th Regiment man. He was shot down, and he spoke French, and so he didn't let on that he did, apparently. And they were having a group underground meeting and figuring out how they were going to get rid of him and get him through safely. And they told a joke in French, and he laughed. And immediately they were very suspicious of him until he assured them that, his mother was French and he spoke French. But he told some harrowing tales about, having the Gestapo come through the trains, and fortunately he said he made a move in the train and they went around him some way or another, and he was not checked, and he got out. They take you down, sent you over the Pyrenees into Spain, and once you got through there, you were in safe hands.
How would a mission basically work from a group formation and the phases? You'd sort of take off, and could you describe that and what your job was all along the way, both out to the target and back?
Yeah. Well, what you would do is you'd take off individually and then form as a squadron, and then as a group, and then as a wing, and then even into a division. And as I think you had, I've forgotten, we've had at least 2 divisions of B-17s and several divisions of B-24s. But they flew different missions because they could not maintain the altitude that we could in a B-17. Their altitude tops was about 20,000 feet. We could go to 28, 30,000 if had to. But the group would then form pretty much in the vicinity of the base. And then at an assemblage point, you'd have the wing. And then the wing would assemble into a division. And by the time we reached the English coast, we were fully assembled and were headed for the target. And along the way, when I first started flying there, we had Spitfire cover. And the amusing incidents we'd had with some of the Poles who flew with the RAF, if they saw any Jerry fighters, they were so hateful of the Jerrys that they would leave the bombers and go chase the fighters. And in the meantime, a few sneaky Jerrys would knock a few of our boys down. But then we had the 47s, as I said, they could take us a little further. And the wing tanks on the 47s even gave us better thing. But it wasn't until the 51s came that we could go to Berlin and have fighter cover over Berlin, which was just a miracle. And the losses of bombers declined pretty fast after that. So they, for example, as we had 25 missions to fly, and we had 18, and they raised it to 30 missions but we had 18, and that kept us on the 25 slate. So that's what we flew.
So back to the Schweinfurt raid. So what happened? You took off that morning, and just walk me through that day.
Well, as I said, we took off, and I got all my stuff together, and I knew pretty well where we were over England. And once we assembled, I would try and get a wind so that I could use it in navigating. We had I've forgotten what, I was going to say a depth finder, but that's not the expression. I've forgotten what it was. But we could use it as a wind scale and determine the direction and the velocity of the wind. And then when applying that to our course, we could pretty well maintain where we were all the way. And we would fly usually on visual contact. We had no radio usage at all. Once we hit the occupied Europe at that time, everything was blasted out by interference. So we had no radio contact. The leaders would have perhaps some contact between, say, wings and divisions, but basically it was radio silence maintained all the way. You would arrive over what they call the initial point, and from then on, the bombardier would usually take over, except we were then flying group bombing. We would drop on the lead plane, and that's what, for example, later, about a year later, what happened to General McNair in France. Somebody mistook either the ground signals or they had an early drop of the bombs and killed, a lot of our boys. It was all an accident of war, which couldn't be helped. But once we were on the IP, the bombardier would take over and head for the target. And the fighter activity, flak would stop, and there'd be a certain amount of fighter activity because they didn't want the shrapnel falling down or on the people below, and also they didn't want to interfere with their fighter planes. So that was usually the fiercest time of the mission. And once you dropped your bombs, you just headed for home. Except every once in a while, on this particular raid that I went to as an auxiliary navigator, they went around twice. And the fellow who was commanding the group at that time was just a terrific flyer and a great guy, but he didn't get a good beat on the target, and they just went at it again. And of course, that cost us a few airplanes too. But once we dropped the bombs, we just took off and made it for home as fast as we could. And of course, then you would start getting more attacks. You'd sometimes, I remember one raid we were coming in. They thought we were going to hit Berlin this day, but it was a town that was west of Berlin, and we had a rendezvous over Denmark with a fighter group. But this time they didn't make the rendezvous, and a whole bunch of Jerrys just came at us from out of the sun and shot down any number of planes. But because we weren't expecting it, and they just tore through our group, took out one of our squadron boys, who's several of his crewmen jumped, and one became a prisoner. Another fellow was killed on the ground, but he brought the plane back safely, because my radio man said, "There goes Winter down in flames," but he brought it under control and brought it all the way back. He was later, and I'll get into this, he was later our plane commander on my last mission, and I have an amusing story to tell you about that, but I'll wait.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it was on our 25th and last mission, and we were flying a deputy group lead, and we flew into this terrible weather, and there were planes all over the place. Nobody knew where they were, and when we finally, I had a very good wind, so I could give a good heading back, And my pilot asked me for the heading. I gave it to him. He said, well, we'll stick around a little while longer. And we did. And finally, you know, at that point, everything was useless. I had nothing to go on. And so we just headed back at 270 degrees, which was a westerly heading. And we broke out over France at about 20,000 feet in a beautiful day. I had no maps of the area. I hadn't the slightest idea, except I knew we were over France. But I did have a radar map, which gave me the coastline. So we approached the coastline, and I determined we were over the Cherbourg Peninsula. And I headed for Rye, England, which is Rye being my town in the United States. And as we went we went right over the beaches of Normandy. And I said, so help me God, I said, what a place for an invasion. Little did I know at that time, unless Eisenhower was monitoring the local correspondence, or rather vocal correspondence. At any rate, we got back, and at that time we had, as a navigational aid, the G-box, which was the forerunner of Loran. It did not work over the continent, but it worked beautifully in England. And once we made the coast of England, we started flying directly to the base. And I put the G-box on, so I knew exactly where we were headed. And the barrage balloons were about 10,000 feet. And we were flying over them, and they made such a racket in our radio that I said, well, let's go down the Thames and get around London and then go back up to the base, which we did. And the poor radio man calls me up and says, Lieutenant Brophy, where are we going? He thought we were headed back for Europe. So I said, don't worry. And so we got back to the base, and this being my 25th mission, in the last 2 or 3 missions, I got in the habit of going up in the nose and lowering the astrodome and sticking my head out and waving. And this time I was up there, and suddenly I felt myself being lifted up. And what had happened was Captain Winters, my plane commander, had hit the wheel switch instead of the flaps, and we just ground to a halt with the whole wheel carriage collapsing, and me halfway out of the astrodome.
So where you were sitting, wasn't there a gun mounted in front of you or above you?
Yeah.
Did you ever have to man the guns?
Oh, sure. We were expected to man the guns, and we did. You know, I did all the time. I don't know whether I ever hit anything, but I had one on just above my navigational desk, and I had one over to the left of the nose, and it was my responsibility to maintain those guns, you know, to use those guns, which I did whenever the need arose, which was rather frequent in the early days.
And would you ever run out of ammunition?
The one time that we came as close to running out of ammunition was when we were attacked over Denmark. We had used up a lot of ammunition before then, and I actually burned out the barrel of my gun at these fighters coming at us, because there was a horde of them, and they all came at us. And it was the end of the gun barrel, because I didn't use it correctly, I guess. I just kept shooting like crazy and burned the barrel right out of shape.
Wow.
And that final mission was also the first time they ever gave us any whiskey. Apparently the British always got a drink after a mission. We never had anything like that, but they decided to adopt that. And so it was my 25th, so we got double. And I tell you, we gave them a good briefing that day. And that was the end of my combat days.
So when you went on your last mission, when did you know that your last mission would be your last mission? Did you know that I have to do 25 or the 25th? When did you know? And then
we never did, because as you advanced in experience, we, for example, would have to fly the weather ship prior to a mission, and we would not fly. they didn't fly an experienced crew every time. They like to save the experienced people for certain missions, I guess. For example, I was asked to become a lead navigator for my squadron, and I would only fly when the squadron led the group. And they promised me a captaincy, but I just didn't want to leave my crew. I was very happy, and I had a wonderful pilot, and I felt that I'd rather be a live first lieutenant than a dead captain. So
when your 25th mission was over, did you know it was your last one?
oh yes, we counted. Don't worry about that. We knew exactly how many missions we had, because we knew, for example, when my co-pilot was shot down, that it was his 25th. And we had gone down, as I said, to greet him, because he never showed. Oh no, you knew all along how many missions you had. So,
before you could go home?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So what were you thinking as you got closer to those last missions? Did your thinking change, or?
Well, my pilot and I were both Catholics, and I noticed he was going to see the priest before every mission, so I decided to join him. And I don't know whether that helped, but I'm sure it didn't hurt. But and the last on that last mission, the local chaplain, the Catholic chaplain, decided he wanted a picture of the airplane. So my pilot and I, and somewhere in my collection, I have a picture of Lieutenant Beckman and Lieutenant Brophy kneeling down and being blessed by this chaplain with the props all bent on the front of this airplane.
So what, when you, on your big mission was Schweinfurt, what other big missions did you go on? Or they didn't have to be strategically big, but just big, hairy missions to go on.
Well, I wish I had the list in front of me. I could tell you. During the first 5 or 6 missions, we went to some horrendous places, and the flak was just, out of this world. And you're flying along in this flak, and it's all so harmless looking out there. But if it ever hit you, you'd be in real trouble, especially loaded with, 10 500-pound bombs. On one of the missions we had, somebody down at 8th Bomber Command at High Wycombe, which was south of London, came up with the idea that we should increase the bomb load. So they put shackles under the wings, and they put a 1,000-pound bomb under each wing. Now, mind you, we're carrying 10 500-pounders in the bomb bay, and a lot of planes that day did not get off the ground. And the results of the mission, I saw the strike photos afterward. We hit, and I don't know whose fault this was, whether it was the group or wing navigator, or wing bombardier rather, but we bombed a Jewish cemetery in Frankfurt. So that was the result of this great extraordinary effort of ours. But that's the way it goes, When you're in the war, a war is very unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen. And sometimes the best laid plans never work out.
Did you develop close relationships with those men on your crew, or did you keep a distance, or how would you?
Well, we were very friendly, but some crews were real palsy-walsy. Our crew, I don't know, there was no particular reason, but they had separate quarters. They went, for example, when we went on to the flak house, they had their own place, the enlisted men. So there was a distinction there, and but there was never any need for any discipline, let's say. As we were a well-knit crew, we were all good friends, and socially we didn't mix at all, but nevertheless we all got along very well together, and there was no need for any command positions on the part of the officers. The only time I think I ever threw my weight around was we had, when we returned from a mission, we had to, officers and enlisted men had to take care of their guns. And we always had a truck driver waiting to take us to briefing. And this one day, I think we'd come back from Anklam. That was the raid that was, we were attacked by these fighters. We opened the escape hatch in the nose, and a torrent of empty shells fell out. As you were asking me about, did they ever run out? I think that was one of the days. And here was this truck driver who had nothing to do but sit on his duff, objected to our going up and cleaning the guns, and he had to wait. It would only take 10 or 15 minutes. And I really laid this guy out. And my crew said, we never, I said, gee, we never saw Lieutenant Brophy act like that before. But I was absolutely furious with this kid. You know. Here he'd been sitting on his ass the whole time we were being shot at, and he's beefing about a few minutes, maybe, so he didn't have his lunch or something. But that was the only occasion I was ever called on to exert my status as an officer.
Would did men talk about being scared, or was that just not done?
No, I don't think anybody talked about it. You see, when you're with a closely knit group, you know, we sustain one another, I guess. It's just, I don't know what the answer is, but you just don't let down your crew, or and I'm sure in the infantry, your buddies, or in the Navy, the same way. You know, you stay together as a group. And with whatever the personal fears were, as I said, the only remark I ever heard was my radio man saying to me, "It's just a matter of time." And I've forgotten whether that was my 5th or 6th mission. I think it was my 6th. But most of the raids that we were on were all pretty rough raids, you know. And then to go to Berlin, that was really one of the big things. But especially when we had the P-51s, it was a whole new ball game with them. If we had gone to Berlin any earlier without that escort, we'd have been slaughtered, I think.
Were these night raids or day raids?
We only fought in the day. The British did night, we did day. And they thought we were crazy, and I don't think I would care to be flying at night in a bomber. Plus, I don't know how in hell's name you navigated, unless you probably couldn't do much celestial, especially if someone was shooting at you. But they preferred it that way, and but they lost a lot of guys. We did too. I think I've forgotten the figures on our killed. It was very, very high in comparison to any other unit in the whole war. Our rate of casualties was higher.
Did you, well, you must have developed friendships with people and then they just didn't come back, or you saw them?
Well, we would, for example, in the hut next to us, we'd see new faces, especially during the latter part of my tour. You'd see some kids come in and you had to get to know them before they're off on a raid and they're gone. 2 or 3 raids. And as I said, as we were veterans, we would fly less frequently. And I guess that was to maintain the experience hands in a group. And
so of the time you were there, you did these missions, these 25 missions. How often would you fly during a typical week?
Well, sometimes we'd fly every day. And as the escorts were more available and more efficient, they flew. Some guys would come in over a little after I did and fly their 25 to 30 missions, 30 missions at that time, and like in a month or 6 weeks, they'd fly every day. And as long as the weather was right, and the weather, I flew in the worst weather. I flew in fall and winter, which is, and the weather in Northern Europe at that time of the year is never good. So we would be weathered in quite a few times. We could not get in the air. But once the weather softened, these fellas would come in and they'd fly a mission every day.
Okay, so what I thought I'd do is I just would run down this mission list here, and if you remember something memorable or something, you could just maybe talk about it. So you've talked about the first one to Moulins-les-Moreux in France on the 26th of September 1943. That was 5 hours. Then the next one was to Emden, Germany. Where do you remember where that was in Germany?
Well, it's up off in the Baltic, and they had a lot of submarines operating out of Emden. The most memorable thing about that was we flew in very close formation, and if you had a wingtip get another, it would almost invariably lead to the destruction of two airplanes. And unfortunately, that happened on one of the first or the second Emden raid, because it was all, and if you went down, you were in the North Sea at that time of the year. It'd be curtains, and so.
You mean your plane hit another plane?
Well, my plane didn't. No, but the planes out. You see, with a tight formation like that, and you had a heavy contrails, and which caused a lot of turbulence, and sometimes a particularly violent shot of turbulence would send one guy into another because you were really tucked in. Looking back, it wasn't at the start of the mission, it certainly wasn't necessary to fly so tightly because over the North Sea, the chances of a fighter attack was rather slim at that point. Once you got in towards the continent, it was a different story.
And then you went to Frankfurt on your fourth mission, and that was about 6 hours and 15
Yeah.
minutes.
I don't remember any particular thing about Frankfurt. There was Mannheim on one side of the river and Frankfurt on the other. That's about the most I can remember about it. But they were all, pretty rough raids because once you hit the Rhine, we were duck soup. But we were very fortunate. Outside of that terrible incident with the windmilling prop and the potential of being lost over France, that was about the worst. I'll tell you an amusing incident about using the G-box, which I described earlier as the forerunner of Lorraine. We would fly the weather ship occasionally, and nothing would please my pilot more than to fly the weather ship because it was a stripped-down B-17, no armament, and he could really put it through some maneuvers, which he enjoyed doing. So we were flying this weather ship this day, and I had just been checked out on the G-box. And we had the radar officer and the PR guy along for the ride. And they were both up in the nose with me. And I would look out the window, and I knew I was over London. And the radar guy says, well, fooled around with the G-box, and he says, we're over the channel. And I looked again, and I said, no, we're over London, the London area. And so he started fooling around again. He says, we're over France. And then I realized, I said, I'd been just checked out, so here's the expert, and he's telling me we're someplace that I know we're not. And it turns out that they were suffering from lack of oxygen because we were over 10,000 feet. I was on oxygen, which was customary. At 10,000, you went on oxygen. And these two guys were not. And so they were acting kind of cuckoo. So I sent them back to the waist so they could put oxygen masks on. And the poor PR guy fell into the bomb bay, which fortunately was empty and closed. And he said, "Oh, I never thought you'd treat me this way." But that was an amusing incident along the way. But
So, did you, as you went on these missions, all 25 of them, did you get superstitious?
no, I think I became a little more religious, and I refrained from any sinful activity, at least what was deemed sinful activity, uh, because I thought I was living close to my Maker. And I thought if I were going to go, I'll go in with a clean slate.
Well, did you think that God was looking out for you personally?
I think in a vague way I did, yeah. I had to think somebody was taking care of me because we were going through some pretty rough times.
Would you get scared a lot of the time?
No, actually, I was surprised at my behavior. Like, for example, when that windmilling prop, here I am, up in the nose with the prop perhaps coming off and slicing the nose and me off with it. And I put on my chest chute, which was a British adaptation, and I put it on because I think we were ready to jump because the plane was really in bad shape. But I stuck it out, and I didn't have any qualms of fear at all. You know, I was rather amazed. So I don't think I'm any great hero, but you have a job to do and you do it, and under trying circumstances, to put it mildly.
Did you think about the future at that point? Can you remember? You may not remember, but did you think about the future, and or did you not allow yourself to think about the future?
No, I don't think so. Every day was a day, you know, and you just went through it, and I didn't have any thoughts about the future. Well, you know, as far as whether I'd survive or not survive, never occurred to me. Just was intent on doing the daily job that I was assigned to do.
Did you think at that point that World War II would be won for certain by the
Oh
Allies?
yes, I bet money on it because I just couldn't see how the Germans could stand any more of these terrible attacks. We were hitting them in the daytime with this masses of tons of destruction, and the British were coming over and doing the same thing at night. It was around-the-clock bombing, as they called it. And I thought the war, this was, as I said, I finished in 1944 in March, and I figured the war would be over by Christmas of '44, and it was not at all.
But you were at the height of the Blitz or the air attack on England. Goring was sending 1,200 planes in a wave, and the Allies were sending just out of England alone something like 2,000 a day.
Yeah, right.
For day in, day out, just bombing away. When you flew over Berlin, I've seen some movie footage of Berlin after it had been bombed? Was it? Could you tell from the altitude?
No, we were too high. You
high.
couldn't identify targets from that height. You know, I mean, individual areas. You just had a vague picture. The one thing I remembered, the first flight over Europe, were the red roofs of the European cities. That to me was the most outstanding thing. All of the houses and buildings had red roofs.
But when you were doing your bombing, you were roughly at about what altitude?
20,000 generally.
So you're pretty. During the Vietnam War, the B-52 bombers were at 26,000 feet roughly, so you were up there pretty above the clouds even. In some cases.
One of the more interesting happenings along the way was that at one point we were flying over Europe, and we were about 28,000 feet, and the co-pilot called me and said the engineer's in trouble. And what had happened was that somehow or other he had come loose from his oxygen mask, and he'd slipped down out of his harness, and they called on me to take a bottle and go up and try and help him, which I did. But the effort that you had to expend at that altitude took a lot out of you. and used up a lot of oxygen too. And I managed to push him back up. He was actually wetting his pants. And apparently this is one of the things that happens to you when you're going into, I think they call it inoxia. Don't quote me on that, but I've forgotten what it was. A lack of oxygen is the correct term, whatever the correct term is for that. But, and finally, after trying to get him back up, and I did a couple of times, I let him out of the harness, and he went on a bottle and revived, and both of us had severe headaches that night, you know. But that was an interesting thing of what happens. Frequently, a radio man, unless you had, my job was to keep contact with all crew members at all times, at regular intervals. And sometimes they'd neglect to do that, and the radio man would, maybe his mask would slip off for whatever reason, or the guy in the ball turret, and they'd die. What would happen? You'd swallow your tongue and choke to death. And that happened in quite a few cases. I lost a friend who was a ball turret gunner in a plane crash over England, poor guy. It just, two planes crashed during an assembly period. And one time when we were flying, the experienced crew would fly the spares. We'd take up 2 wingmen. And if someone dropped for malfunction of the engine or whatever reason, or equipment, we'd send the wingman in to replace him. And we got down to one plane, and that was us. I said, let's leave right now. And we did. And at that time, there were 2 air divisions approaching one another on a collision course. And that's when we sort of left the area. But, you know, there wasn't any mass collision or that was averted, but that type of thing would happen every now and then, you know.
So you weren't thinking about the future at all? Like, will I grow up and have a family, or
no,
nothing?
Not at all. Never gave it a thought.
You think it's because?
Oh, I think my wife. I think the girl I married right after the war, after my return rather, I had plans to marry her. I suppose I would say that, but that's about the extent of it. You know, I had no idea whether I'd stay in the service or go into private industry or what.
And you thought you'd make it back. Did you ever have a feeling of whether you'd make it back or
no,
not? Or?
never entered my mind. I never was cocky enough to assume I was going to finish up, but I guess I shouldn't say I guess I never felt in danger, you know. Just did my job, whatever it entailed.
Were there a lot of other guys that you knew that just wouldn't come back, or other? I mean, there must have been, based on the numbers.
Well,
you go out on a typical mission, and you had been eating dinner with the guy the night before, and then he's gone.
Well, you see, you were pretty well. Your relationship were confined pretty much to your crew, and members of your own squadron, and the guys in the tent. I mean, in the cabin or shack or Nason hut, actually. And we would have some crews come in, and we'd barely get to know them. Captain Winter's crew was probably the first group that they had been there ahead of us, and they were the first ones lost. But they were, I think we had either 2 or 4 groups of officers in each hut. And the hut next to us, guys would come and go all the time, and we wouldn't even get to know them. And,
was that intentional that they kept you separated, do you think, or was that just the way the huts were set?
No, it's just the way it worked out. I don't think there was any intention there at all. But a lot of crews would all buddy together, and they'd all go down to the pub together. We never did that. I don't know. I would go to Cambridge a lot more than, say, the rest of my crew. And I made some good friends in Cambridge during the war. And I think I liked girls more than the other guys did. Because I remember we went to, a very amusing point about morals, I guess. This chap that was in the 7th Regiment with me was in pilot training and navigation training with me, washed out, became a ball turret gunner. And we were on leave, and we went to the officers in my crew. We went to the Windmill Theater, which was a 24-hour vaudeville semi-burlesque theater. And who was there but this fellow who was the best friend of mine back in New York. And he was the ball turret gunner. So he liked girls too. So we went out. We were at a hotel, and my other officers were all with me. And he joined us. And he and I started dancing with a couple of gals, very attractive gals. So I said to one of them, why don't you have dinner with us? And she said, well, you ask the sergeant.
Okay, so anyway, you went into Cambridge or London and went dancing.
Right. We were at the Piccadilly Hotel, and we were tea dancing. A sergeant and I, as I said, he was one of my closest friends back in the States. And I invited this girl to join us for dinner. We would go to a restaurant the English called it Potomac, or Potomac. And it was a nice restaurant with a band and everything. So she said, well, you talk to the sergeant. So he and I went to the head, and I said, what's she talking about? She wanted me to talk to you. I asked her to come out to dinner with us. He says, well, there are a couple of pros, and she wanted you to know that. So I, being holier than thou, I said, well, that's too bad. That's the end of that. So, but he went on. I had a letter from him. My officers and I all went on to the Potomac, and he went off with this other girl, and he said he had a great time. He wrote me and said everything was on the house and everything was wonderful. And then the poor guy was killed in a mid-air collision. And I never went to see his mother. I don't know whether I could have found her, but of course, I didn't have much time either. I was going out to get married. But she had lost 2 boys. They were Norwegian born, and they had come to America. And both these boys were killed in the 8th Air Force. One was a flight officer, and the other was my friend, the ball turret gunner. Terrific guys, too. And I often thought that poor woman, losing those 2 kids. Well, but other than my co-pilot, the fact that we lost guys here and there really didn't have any great effect on me. I don't think it was a question of being heartless, but it was just the price you paid, sort of, I don't know whether I'm heartless or not, but I guess it's to be expected to lose somebody. But I never lost anyone close to me. The time we had that windmilling prop that I mentioned earlier, where my co-pilot came to our assistance, we had a co-pilot who really went haywire. He didn't know quite what to do. He wanted to cut this line, cut that line, and my pilot just stayed calm, cool, and collected, and brought us back safely. And up to that, I said, I'll never fly with that guy again, and I never did. We never had him. I don't know where he went after that, but he certainly was not very cool under stress. And you can't have that happen. You got to have a cool head. My pilot was only about 19, and just as calm, cool, and collected as you ever saw. Never got excited, no matter what was going on. Never started shouting orders over the phone or do this or do that. And we had a good crew, I think, by and large.
What do you think makes great leadership?
It depends. I mean, in the terms of being in a war, for example. Well, the ability to first of all, I think you have to have confidence in the guy, and he has to be pretty courageous. He has to be cool above all things, and I don't mean it in the sense that the kids use today. He just has to have a good head in times of stress and know what to do. And I've been very fortunate in most of the people I've had to deal with. We had a fellow come in to take command of our squadron who came off submarine patrol. And he was major at that time. And a major coming in without combat experience would be assigned to, say, to a plane with a first lieutenant pilot who had 15 to 20 missions under his belt, and this guy was a greenhorn, because you can't compare submarine patrol to the type of stuff we were doing. And he became very autocratic and said, he called a meeting of all the officers in the squadron, and it was usual, what the hell, we had an expression, which is very vulgar, but you know, it was commonly used in the Army. But at any rate, he said, I expect you officers to be able to run the PX or maintain the laundry and all this kind of stuff. And I opened up my big trap and said, well, Major, you know, what better way can you judge us than by our ability to handle the job in hand that we're doing? And I don't know whether that didn't sit well with him, but I got a satisfactory rating out of it, which was a kiss of death. You know, you either got excellent or you just, I don't know that mattered too much because I didn't intend to stay in the military anyway. But my pilot never got his captaincy either. One of the ways to get it would be to go up to headquarters and fly. Again, if I had taken that route, you know, I'd have been captain, but I might also be dead. So.
Now, what do you think? What's a hero?
Well, we really didn't think in terms of heroes. You know, it was more or less. I don't think that we had an opportunity to be individual heroes. Well, I back up on that. In some cases, you had where a pilot was shot and replaced by either a navigator or a bombardier or somebody who had some idea of what to do in the airplane and yet was not an experienced hand and could bring it back safely. I'd say he was a hero. I think a guy in the North Sea in the middle of November who kept everybody's spirits up when you're in a little dinghy waiting to be rescued, if ever. You know, that's a hero. But heroes are you know, they just happen, I think. It all just depends on the situations. Some guys turn tail and run. Heroes don't.
What do you think bravery is?
Well, bravery could be a little bit of foolhardiness. I think that an awful lot of guys that are brave, and whether it's who are somewhat foolhardy. I think that, you know, just in the face of overwhelming enemy fire, to expose yourself to do something, you may be considered quite brave, but I think most combat guys would say he's crazy.
What's duty?
Oh, I'm sorry, what's duty?
Yeah, what is duty?
Well, it's hard to put your finger on that. It's, I think it's the assumption of a job and to try and do it to the best of your ability. I don't want to embellish it any more than that. It's just doing your job.
What do you think, besides orders, made you go on those flights? You could have said, I can't take this anymore.
Well, again, you would be letting down your crew. And I think that's probably the most important thing. here you were part of it, and now you're on the sidelines, and they may go off and get killed, and you're not there.
After, you know, all of this, did you learn anything from the war? Any one thing?
I don't know that I have, you know. It's just that it's such a waste, I think, by and large. The amount of effort that we put into the destruction and then turn around and rebuild all of that destruction, the lives that were lost. In retrospect, you know. But on the other hand, it was worth it, I think, the way the world turned out. But it's a terrible waste. We lost so many men in training, guys running into mountains, crashing aircraft, and so on. And not everybody lived to go on to combat. But I don't know that I learned any particular lesson. I think it was a great experience. And at my age, of course, I'm not about to try it again. And but when I look back, I think, you know, I enlisted. I was very, very determined not to be drafted because my father had fought in the Indian Rebellion in Canada, the Louis Riel Rebellion, which we don't know much about in this country, but every Canadian knows all about it. And my stepfather was a volunteer in World War II. And so when this situation came along, I enlisted in the New York National Guard, the 7th Regiment, which was one of the few top regiments in the National Guard throughout the country, which we don't seem to have anymore. You know, they were semi-social organizations, and we were called a Silk Stocking Regiment, and it was really, you know, we never got paid. All our money went into the maintenance of the armory, and we always had a company valet who ironed the uniforms and kept them in good shape. Not our regular stuff, but all our dress uniforms. And we would go have parties and that kind of stuff.
So what do you think patriotism is in the context of the times and the way you lived it?
Well, I think part of patriotism was why I enlisted. I've been always brought up, my country, better, what is it, there was a phrase, for better or worse, my country. I've always felt that way about it. And I think that we've been given a big break in the world, in this country, the way we live, the way we run it, with all its faults and blemishes. I still think it's the greatest country in the world. And the South has always been, in my opinion, the bastion of patriotism. And we see it, you know, even though you might think the Confederacy was all wrong, you could see the same ideals motivated those young men. And we lost the cream of our youth in that war. So.
Well, on behalf of my generation, I'd like to thank you for what you did, because I can't conceive of remotely doing what you did. So thank you.
Not at all. Delighted.
I don't have anything else. That's pretty much it.